He laughed and shouted in the guardsman's face, feeling like the king of the stage. But the moment he laid a hand on the soldier, he was on the ground within seconds, the whole world watching his humiliation. Buckingham Palace was particularly lively that day. Sunlight danced on the golden gates, camera flashes flickered among the crowd, and tourists strolled leisurely across the square, admiring the royal guard. They stood in their usual poses, motionless, statuesque, as if carved from stone. For most visitors, this was more than just a landmark. To some, it was a symbol of the nation. To others, a chance to touch history, to witness something majestic that had withstood the test of time. People snapped photos, whispered in admiration, while some simply stood in silence, absorbing the spectacle. But, as always, there was one in the crowd for whom just looking was never enough. He appeared suddenly, loud, confident, walking like someone accustomed to being the center of attention. A young man, tall and athletic, his tanned skin and expensive watch glinting in the sunlight. Dressed in a stylish tracksuit with high-end headphones draped around his neck, he stood out among the typical tourists with his brazen demeanor. His smartphone was already recording. His steps were quick, assertive, and as he approached the barrier, people instinctively moved aside. Unlike the others, who kept a respectful distance, this guy saw no boundaries. He wasn't here to admire tradition. He was here to entertain. Positioning himself in front of one of the guards, he stopped, glanced around, and smirked. The crowd buzzed with murmurs, some already turning toward him, sensing something unusual about to unfold. He paid them no mind. In his world, only the phone screen and the number of views he would get from this video mattered. The guard before him, Sergeant Alex White, stood motionless. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face was unreadable, his stance flawless, hands pressed at his sides, feet shoulder-width apart, back straight as if sculpted from stone. For him, this was just another day on duty. For the young man, it was an opportunity to create legendary content. The crowd kept taking photos, moving in and out of the scene, but now they were beginning to notice that this particular tourist was being too loud, too brazen. At first, he simply stood in front of the guard, inspecting him like a mannequin in a museum. Then, he took a few steps closer. Spectators started watching with curiosity. Some turned their heads toward him, while others pulled out their phones. Tourists knew the unspoken rule. The guards were untouchable. You could watch, take photos, but never interfere. But this guy decided that rules didn't apply to him. First, he leaned in slightly, intruding into the guard's personal space. The noise of the crowd faded just a little, as if everyone sensed the shift in atmosphere. Then, his movements became sharper, more aggressive. He waved his hands in front of the guard's face, testing if he would blink. At one point, he leaned in so close that mere inches separated their faces. The crowd exchanged glances. Someone chuckled, but most looked uncomfortable. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't a joke anymore. The young man felt like the star of the scene. The crowd was watching. The cameras were rolling. Then, he did something no one expected. He suddenly leaned in and shouted directly into the guard's face. Loud, sharp. On the verge of hysteria, his voice echoed across the square. The sound was so jarring that even some in the crowd flinched. And then, everything changed. A heavy silence fell over the scene. People stopped smiling. The guard didn't move. But an eerie tension filled the air, as if something unexpected was about to happen. The echo of his shout still lingered, but it no longer triggered laughter. The once chattering crowd had gone still, watching, waiting. People glanced from the tourist to the guard and back again. This was no longer harmless fun. But the young man didn't seem to notice. He straightened up, smirked, and stared into his phone's camera. He was still recording, still convinced he was in control. The guard remained motionless. Sergeant Alex White stood exactly as he had before. Rigid posture, squared shoulders, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the cocky tourist didn't exist, as if there had been no yelling, no provocation at all. But now, the tension was almost tangible. The young man glanced around again. The expressions that had once been curious had changed. No one was smiling anymore. People were looking at him differently, some with irritation, others with confusion, some with outright disdain. The reaction he had hoped for never came. But now, he had become the focus of attention. There was no laughter, just silence. And that silence began to unsettle him. He had been so sure he would get something from the guard, maybe a blink, a twitch, even a subtle tightening of the jaw. But there was nothing, and the longer the silence stretched, the more frustrated he became. He was used to controlling situations. His world revolved around likes, comments, views. He lived for content, for the attention, for the thrill of being watched. But now, he felt like he was losing control. The scene he had envisioned wasn't playing out the way he had planned. For a moment, he hesitated. How could he make this moment even more viral? He needed more. Just standing there was boring. Just waving in the guard's face was predictable. What if he touched him? The thought struck suddenly. He knew it was forbidden to touch the guards, but that was precisely what would make his video legendary. He glanced at his phone again, adjusted his hair, and smirked. Then he reached out and lightly poked the guard's shoulder. A small, almost playful movement. But it changed everything. The crowd gasped. Even those recording stopped focusing on him and turned their attention to the guard, waiting to see what would happen next. But nothing happened. Sergeant Alex White didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even change his breathing. The young man grinned. "Come on, bro, give me something." Nothing. It wasn't enough for him. Now he felt like his video was losing impact. People were whispering, but not in excitement, in judgment. Some glared at him in open disapproval. A young woman with a camera frowned. An older man with a neatly trimmed beard shook his head and muttered something, clearly unimpressed. But the tourist didn't notice. All he saw was his camera, and the numbers already forming in his mind. Millions of views, thousands of likes, tens of thousands of new followers. He just needed a little more. The crowd watched. Phones recorded. And then he took the final step. Bold, reckless, fully aware of what he was doing. He grabbed the guard's shoulder and yanked it. Not hard enough to knock him over, but firm enough to say, "Come on, move." And at that moment, his world collapsed. It happened in a fraction of a second. Later, those who had recorded it would replay the footage in slow motion, but in real time, it happened too fast to process. First, a step forward. Not just a shift, not a slight turn of the head. A precise, swift, and deliberate step forward, as if triggered by an instinct ingrained in his very being. Second, a sharp, resounding impact. Third, a body hitting the ground. Before anyone could comprehend what had happened, the tourist was already sprawled across the stone pavement, and a stunned silence engulfed the crowd. Everything happened too fast for the crowd to fully grasp what had just transpired. A moment ago, the tourist had stood before the guard, brimming with confidence, convinced of his own invincibility. He had laughed, basked in the attention, believing he controlled the scene. But now he was on the ground. The sound of his fall echoed across the square, making some onlookers flinch. His phone, flung from his hand, skidded across the pavement and landed screen up, still recording. The camera was still rolling, capturing the moment of his disgrace. The crowd froze. Even the wind seemed to pause for a second. No one moved. All eyes were fixed on the same thing. The young man sprawled across the stone pavement, his shocked expression, his trembling hands pressing against the cold ground as he struggled to push himself up. But the worst part wasn't the fall. The worst part was the silence. The guard had not made a single unnecessary movement after the tourist hit the ground. He remained in the same rigid posture, as if nothing had happened, as if he couldn't care less about what had just transpired, as if the young man was nothing more than a piece of trash that had landed in the wrong place and had simply been removed. That indifference burned more than any strike. The tourist still couldn't comprehend how he had ended up on the ground. He hadn't even had time to react. Just a sudden shift in space, the cold stone beneath his back, the abrupt change in his position. He had no idea what the guard had done. He only knew one thing. He had lost, and the crowd had seen it. A few people exchanged glances. Someone covered their mouth with their hand. Others simply recorded, while some just watched, reveling in the spectacle. A murmur began to spread. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a whisper rippling through the crowd. But with each passing second, it grew louder. What the hell just happened? A few tourists chuckled. Someone smirked. A young woman in glasses shook her head in disbelief as she replayed the moment on her phone. An elderly gentleman in a tailored coat, holding a leather umbrella, gave the faintest of smiles and murmured to his companion, "Just like the good old days." But the most painful part for the tourist wasn't the judgment. The most painful part was that no one helped him. Just minutes ago, he had been the center of attention. The crowd had watched his antics. Some had even laughed along. Others had cheered him on. And now, he was alone. No one extended a hand. No one asked if he was okay. They just stared, as if he were part of a performance, an attraction, a scene they were watching unfold, without any desire to intervene. He tried to get up quickly, but his legs wobbled. It took him 2 tries before he could stand. Somewhere in the crowd, someone snickered. He clenched his fists, scanning the faces around him. Everyone was watching and enjoying it. He spun toward the guard, but he never finished his sentence. The guard didn't even glance at him. He stood exactly as he had a moment ago. Perfect posture, impeccable stance, cold, unwavering gaze fixed straight ahead, as if this tourist didn't exist at all. And in that moment, the young man realized that he hadn't just lost physically. He had lost on every level. He hadn't just fallen. He had been reduced to nothing. He no longer mattered. All the cameras, all the attention, all the fascination had shifted away from him. Everyone was looking at the guard now. The man who stood unshaken, just as his predecessors had stood for centuries before him. The man who could not be broken. The man who had defeated him with a single movement. And that was the true humiliation. He no longer controlled the moment. Now he was part of someone else's spectacle. The crowd waited. They wanted to see what he would do next. And he knew that the best thing he could do now was leave. As quickly as possible. As far away as possible. But he also knew this moment would never be erased. Because the cameras were still rolling. And soon, the whole world would see how he had been put in his place by a man who hadn't even acknowledged his existence afterward. The crowd still hadn't moved. Only a few seconds had passed, but to the tourist, those seconds stretched into eternity. He stood there, breathing heavily, unable to fully process what had happened. Everything around him sounded muffled, as if he were underwater. The world that had been his stage just moments ago had now turned against him. He looked around. He was used to the crowd being on his side, laughing at his jokes, cheering on his stunts. He had always assumed they shared his outlook, that the world was a playground and confidence alone could grant him permission to do whatever he pleased. But now he saw the truth. They weren't laughing with him. They were laughing at him. The murmur grew. Somewhere in the crowd, muffled snickers turned into audible laughter. Someone raised their phone higher, zooming in for a better shot of his humiliation. "Serves clowns like him right? Maybe this'll be a lesson for the others." He heard every word. A knot twisted in his stomach. This isn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the hero of his own videos. Now, he was the victim of someone else's. He tried to take a step forward, but his leg wobbled again. The crowd responded with another round of quiet giggles. Someone even mockingly clapped. His skin burned as if his face had been doused in boiling water. Laughter, whispers, phones still recording. He had become a tourist attraction, but not the kind he had wanted to be. Now he was the main spectacle of the day. He looked back at the guard. Sergeant Alex White still hadn't looked at him, still stood firm. No gloating, no reaction, no interest, as if the tourist didn't exist. And that was what destroyed him the most. If the guard had smiled triumphantly, if he had smirked or even given a knowing glance, it would have been easier to bear. But he didn't. He simply ignored him, as if he was nothing more than empty space. That was worse than any humiliation. He scanned the crowd, looking for a single person who would meet his eyes with understanding, someone who might say, "Hey man, don't sweat it, it happens." But there was no one. People were either recording, whispering mockingly, or simply watching the spectacle unfold with enjoyment. Something inside him boiled. Anger, rage, humiliation. He couldn't just walk away. It couldn't end like this. He wasn't supposed to be the victim. He clenched his fists. He wanted to say something, wanted to shout something at the crowd, to defend himself, to turn it into a joke. But his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. The words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew. No one would buy it. No one would be on his side. Everyone had already made their decision. They had already chosen who was right, and who was the clown who had just been put in his place. Somewhere in the crowd, a middle-aged man in an elegant coat folded his arms and murmured to his companion, "I wonder how he's going to explain this one." His entire body burned with shame. He wanted to disappear, but to walk away would mean accepting defeat. He forced himself to straighten his posture, tried to make his face look indifferent, but his fingers still trembled. He took a few steps back. The crowd didn't part for him. They just kept watching, recording every moment, and he knew once he walked away, this video would spread across the world. This is what happens when you don't understand boundaries. By tomorrow, it would be trending. Thousands of comments, thousands of people laughing at him. But the worst part? It didn't even matter. The guard remained at his post, unbothered, unshaken, untouched by the scene. And that meant the only life that had changed today was his own. He who thought he was above everyone. He who believed he could do anything. He who thought the guards were just costumed clowns. Now, he was the clown. His jaw clenched. He turned sharply and walked away. But he knew nothing would change now. This moment would never be erased. And the video? That would last forever. 1 second. Just a single moment. And now he was that guy. The one the whole internet was laughing at. As he walked away from the square, he thought the worst was behind him. Sure, it was embarrassing, humiliating even, but soon it would be forgotten, right? After all, he was just a tourist, an ordinary guy in a big city. But he didn't realize how fast humiliation spreads in the age of the internet. He returned to his hotel, locked the door, tossed his phone onto the bed, and buried his face in the pillow. His head pounded, his fingers still trembled from the adrenaline, and in his ears he could still hear the crowd, their laughter, their mocking whispers. He didn't want to check social media, but anxiety gnawed at him with every passing second. Finally, he sat up slowly, grabbed his phone, and pressed the lock button. The screen lit up. 99 plus notifications. His body went cold. He opened the first one. It was a tag in a video. He tapped it, and in that instant, his world collapsed. Everything was online. The video of his fall had spread like wildfire. At first, it appeared in the Instagram stories of bystanders. Then, someone posted it on TikTok. Another uploaded it to Twitter. Thousands of likes, hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments. By the time he grasped what had happened, it was already too late. He had become a meme. Screenshots of his fall flooded social media with captions like, "The exact moment he realized rules exist for a reason." Every second had been dissected. His smug face in front of the guard, his hand reaching out. The moment he suddenly found himself airborne. And most humiliating of all, the completely composed expression of the guardsman, who hadn't even looked at him afterward. But the worst part? The sound. The dull thud of his body hitting the stone pavement. That sound was now immortalized in internet history. The comments were merciless. How dumb can you be? Did he really think the guards were just statues? The more he scrolled, the stronger the urge to erase himself from the internet. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst part was the news. The next day, major media outlets picked up the story. Tourist tries to provoke royal guard, immediately regrets it. One of the most embarrassing moments ever caught on camera. How British guards maintain their composure against disrespectful tourists. This wasn't just a viral video anymore. This was a lesson for the world. Thousands of social media users condemned his behavior. People recalled how tourists had harassed the guards for years, and now they all agreed. He got exactly what he deserved. He watched as commentators analyzed his fall, laughed at his reaction, and discussed how pathetic he had looked. Everyone knew his face. Everyone knew his story. Everyone knew that he had lost, against a man who hadn't even acknowledged his existence. He gripped his head, breathing heavily. How do I stop this? He tried deleting his social media accounts, but it was too late. People had saved copies. The internet had already spread it everywhere. There was no escaping this. And the worst part, he knew that this moment would haunt him forever. He had just been a tourist. But now he was the guy who got wrecked by a royal guard, and there was no running from that. While his humiliating video racked up millions of views and countless mocking comments, while memes of his fall flooded social media and news sites dissected his arrogance, Sergeant Alex White stood at his post, just like yesterday, just like the day before, just like the generations of guards who had stood before him for hundreds of years. For him, nothing had changed. He wasn't reading the comments. He wasn't checking the news. He wasn't following the trending hashtags. He was just doing his job. He didn't need to see how the world admired his discipline. He didn't need to read how millions were praising his unwavering composure. He just stood. London continued its rhythm. The streets bustled with traffic. Buses unloaded fresh waves of tourists. The square in front of Buckingham Palace filled once more with people holding cameras. They came to see the guardians of the monarchy, men who had stood their ground for centuries, as steadfast as British tradition itself. But today felt different. The crowd behaved differently. People approached the barriers with caution. Some still held up their phones, but not to provoke, only to capture the strength, the discipline, the stoicism. Others simply watched in silence. And though no one spoke aloud, they all knew what had happened here yesterday. They knew that the royal guards were not just a tourist attraction. They knew that these men could not be broken. Now, no one tried to mock them. No one shouted in their faces. No one staged idiotic stunts. They just watched. Some with admiration, some with respect, some perhaps with a quiet sense of guilt for all the years tourists had treated the Royal Guard as mere props in their vacation photos. But now, after yesterday, everyone understood. This was not a game. Some tourists, as they passed, gave small nods to the guards, as if to say, "We see you now. We know you are more than just a costume." Some even whispered, "Thank you for your service." The guards, of course, did not respond. They couldn't, but they heard, and that meant more than applause ever could. And what of the tourist? What happened to the guy who had laughed, thinking he could create viral content? He left London. That very night, he packed his bags and disappeared. No more online presence, no more social media, no more internet, no responses to messages. But it didn't matter anymore, because his shame was already part of history. He could delete his accounts. He could erase his old videos. He could shut himself off from the world. But he couldn't erase the footage that now belonged to the internet. He couldn't make millions of people forget his humiliation. He would forever be remembered as the tourist who crossed the line and paid the price. Sergeant Alex White still stood at his post. He didn't know the tourist's name. He didn't know how many millions of people were watching his reaction. He didn't know how many memes now featured his stoic expression. He just stood there, calm, unshaken, unyielding. And in that moment, one thing became clear. Yesterday, that tourist didn't just lose to a guardsman. He lost to an entire tradition.